It happened without warning. After 39 days of complete silence, Tyler Robinson, the man standing trial for the fatal shooting at a Charlie Kirk event, finally spoke. The courtroom fell silent. Reporters stopped typing. Viewers watching the live feed leaned closer to their screens, expecting perhaps an apology, a confession, or a statement of regret. Instead, Robinson looked at the judge and said calmly, "I'd like some new clothes." That single sentence carried a weight no one expected. For more than a month, Robinson had refused to respond to any question, acknowledge any lawyer, or even react to the evidence presented against him. Now his voice, measured, quiet, and strangely composed, cut through the tension like a blade. It wasn't what he said, but when and how he said it that left the courtroom stunned. If you haven't already, subscribe for continuing updates as this story unfolds. From that moment, every analyst, psychologist, and journalist watching the case seemed to interpret the request differently. To some, it signaled a fragile step towards self-awareness after weeks of psychological withdrawal. To others, it seemed calculated, a deliberate attempt to shift public perception, to humanize himself in front of the jury, and perhaps to regain some measure of control over how the world saw him. Robinson's silence had become one of the trial's most baffling mysteries. Throughout the proceedings, he sat motionless, his expression unreadable. He neither reacted to witnesses nor to the footage played in court. Legal experts noted that silence in such high-profile cases is rare and often strategic. It can frustrate the prosecution, complicate psychiatric assessments, and blur the line between mental instability and deliberate non-cooperation. But in Robinson's case, the quiet became something deeper, a kind of unspoken presence that left everyone guessing what, if anything, he was thinking. His defense team had previously cited concerns about his mental state, suggesting his silence reflected emotional trauma rather than defiance. Psychologists called to testify offered varying perspectives. Some believed the prolonged quiet might reflect dissociation, a psychological defense mechanism where the mind detaches from distressing reality. Others speculated that it could indicate selective mutism, a rare condition triggered by extreme stress or fear. Still, a few experts argued that Robinson might be making a calculated decision to remain silent as a way of controlling the courtroom dynamic. When he finally spoke, then, the meaning behind those 6 words, "I'd like some new clothes," became a puzzle in itself. Was it a practical statement? A sign of progress? Or a carefully timed signal designed to reshape the atmosphere of the trial? Prosecutors quickly moved to interpret it as a sign of clarity. If Robinson could express personal needs and comprehend his surroundings, they argued, then he was aware enough to understand the gravity of the situation. They suggested his awareness had been intact all along, implying that his silence might have been intentional rather than involuntary. But psychologists urged caution. Interpreting behavior in moments of trauma, they explained, requires nuance. A person can appear lucid in one moment and deeply withdrawn the next. It's possible that speaking up was a breakthrough, one clinical expert told reporters outside the courthouse, but it's also possible that it was merely procedural, an effort to manage comfort, not confession. What remains clear is that Tyler Robinson's quiet request for new clothes changed everything about the atmosphere in the courtroom. For nearly 6 weeks, the trial had been dominated by the language of science and law, charts, timestamps, data logs, forensic analyses, and digital reconstructions. Every discussion was about numbers and evidence, not about the person at the center of it all. Then, in one brief moment, that changed. His voice, calm but deliberate, introduced something the courtroom hadn't heard before: human unpredictability. It wasn't evidence, but it had power. It reminded everyone that behind every report and every piece of data stood a person, flawed and complex, whose motives could not be measured by forensics alone. For weeks, prosecutors had walked the jury through what they called an unbroken chain of proof. Investigators testified that Robinson's DNA was found on the weapon recovered near the scene, and gunshot residue on his clothing matched samples collected that night. Forensic specialists presented slides and models detailing the ballistic trajectory, linking it directly to the firearm registered in Robinson's name. Security footage, synchronized with phone location data, placed him near the venue moments before the attack occurred. To most observers, the scientific evidence seemed to leave little room for doubt. But trials are rarely that simple. As any seasoned legal analyst will tell you, evidence can show what happened, but not why. Motive, intent, and state of mind are the invisible variables that often decide how justice is defined. And that is precisely what this courtroom has been struggling to uncover. The prosecution argues that Robinson's actions were premeditated, citing a digital trail that, in their view, demonstrates planning and resentment. Among the files retrieved from his encrypted device were fragments of deleted messages, snippets of thought that prosecutors interpreted as signs of growing frustration. This wasn't random, one prosecutor said during testimony. It was the result of weeks of fixation. But the defense has offered a sharply different interpretation. They contend that those messages, viewed in isolation, cannot be separated from context or emotion. To them, the fragments reveal not planning, but instability. A young man overwhelmed, detached from reality, and struggling with mental health issues long before the tragedy occurred. That question, intent versus collapse, has defined the trial's emotional core. And it's what made Robinson's sudden decision to speak so disarming. Until that moment, he had been a silent figure at the defense table, his expression unreadable. The jury had only ever seen him through the lens of reports and evidence. But when he requested new clothes, something shifted. It was a gesture so small, so human, that it momentarily pulled the trial out of the technical and into the emotional. Psychologists who have followed the case suggest that such a moment can indicate many things. It could represent an emerging awareness, a sign that the defendant is re-engaging with his surroundings after a period of psychological withdrawal. It might also signal a desire for dignity, a small attempt to reclaim personal identity in a process that strips defendants of individuality. Others, however, interpret it differently. They see it as a strategic move, perhaps an instinctive understanding that appearance shapes perception. After all, juries are human too. Seeing a defendant in civilian clothing rather than a detention uniform can alter the emotional tone of a trial. That complexity, human, psychological, and symbolic, has made this trial one of the most watched in recent memory. But it has also sparked broader reflection beyond the courtroom. The contrast between Robinson's online persona and his behavior in court has become a focal point of discussion. Online, Robinson once appeared confident, even articulate. His social media accounts, now sealed under court order, portrayed a person who expressed strong opinions, often framed with sharp logic and conviction. He debated others frequently, posted long reflections on current events, and seemed deeply engaged with the world around him. Yet in the courtroom, that same person appears almost absent, detached, silent, and at times unresponsive. This sharp divide has led psychologists and sociologists to revisit a question that defines the modern age. How much of who we are online truly reflects who we are in reality? The digital world allows people to project certainty, confidence, and emotion in carefully crafted ways. But when the physical world demands accountability, that certainty can collapse. Robinson's case has become a study in that collapse, the dissonance between a virtual identity built on words and a real-world self paralyzed by silence. It's a duality that feels hauntingly familiar in our time. We live in an era where public personas are shaped through screens, where narratives move faster than evidence, and where outrage often precedes understanding. This trial has become, in many ways, a mirror for that phenomenon. When Robinson's name first hit headlines, online discussion exploded. Within hours, hashtags trended. Debates raged across platforms. Opinions were formed, shared, and amplified long before the first day of testimony began. Some commentators painted him as a villain. Others saw him as a cautionary figure, a product of digital echo chambers and social disconnection. Experts warn that this rush to judgment, though understandable, distorts the slow, difficult work of real justice. Human behavior is rarely simple, and cases like this reveal just how fragile our assumptions can be. The courtroom is a space for patience, one legal scholar noted, but the internet is not. And while the online world speculates, inside the courtroom, a different kind of silence reigns. The victim's family attends every session, sitting quietly behind the prosecution. They do not speak to reporters during recesses. They do not react to the defense's arguments or the prosecution's evidence. But their presence speaks volumes. Each hearing reminds everyone that beyond the debates over psychology and motive lies a family still grieving. When Robinson spoke for the first time, a journalist in the gallery noticed the victim's widow lower her head. For her, that moment was not about legal interpretation, it was about emotion. Later, she spoke briefly outside the courthouse. "Words won't bring him back," she said softly, "but truth still matters." That statement, simple and raw, encapsulated what this case has come to represent: the search for truth, not just verdicts. Yet truth, in this trial, remains elusive. Each day, new interpretations surface, but definitive answers stay out of reach. The prosecution maintains its stance that Robinson's actions were deliberate and coherent. The defense continues to stress psychological instability and diminished capacity. The judge, aware of the gravity of both perspectives, has ordered additional psychological evaluations to ensure fairness. But beyond the legal arguments, this trial has started to feel like a broader social study, one about how people cope with uncertainty, how societies handle tragedy, and how quickly narratives can form before facts fully emerge. Robinson's stillness, and then his sudden voice, became symbols in themselves. They reflect a collective discomfort with silence in an age that demands constant explanation. We live in a culture that asks for answers before understanding that some questions have none. That is perhaps what makes this trial so unsettling. It doesn't just challenge the boundaries of criminal responsibility, it challenges how we think about perception, empathy, and truth. Can justice coexist with compassion? Can silence ever be interpreted without distortion? As the proceedings continue, the conversation grows larger than one man or one tragedy. Commentators, ethicists, and media observers have begun discussing what this case reveals about the intersection of mental health, public pressure, and media influence. The trial has shown that facts can coexist with mystery, and that even in a courtroom built on evidence, not everything can be proven by data alone. In the end, Robinson's simple request for new clothes has done more than change his appearance. It has changed the tone of an entire trial. It reminded everyone, jurors, lawyers, viewers, that justice is not a purely mechanical process. It's human, unpredictable, and full of contradictions. The case will continue, and so will the questions. The court will sift through evidence, testimonies, and expert analyses. But the larger truth, the one that exists beyond the verdict, may never be fully known. It lives in the quiet moments, a defendant's sudden words, a widow's whispered grief, and a society's uneasy reflection on how easily perception becomes reality. Because in the end, justice is not only about guilt or innocence. It's about understanding what drives human behavior and how fragile the line between reason and confusion can be. Tyler Robinson's request might not change the outcome of the trial, but it has already changed the conversation around it. It forced everyone to remember that even in the most procedural moments, humanity still lingers, quiet, unpredictable, and profoundly real. Stay informed. Subscribe for continuing coverage and thoughtful analysis as this story develops.